300 old soldiers, a bishop in a wool cope with an iron cross at his neck, 30,000 Persians on the other side of an unmortared basalt wall on the Armenian plateau in the autumn of the year 502, the 78th night of the siege. A sound under the south tower that is wrong, and a 54-year-old former notary who has never held a sword in his life lowers his ear to the dark basalt and hears it before anyone else does. The sound is a faint, dry rasp, not the chink of a pickaxe, something softer, something patient. Bishop Eutychios counts. He has been counting since the second week of the siege. The Persian sappers under the tower are now perhaps 5 paces in, maybe 6. There is a particular silence that means they have hit the basalt grit, the loose volcanic gravel that the engineers of Constantius packed between the unmortared blocks 120 years ago when they raised the walls of Theodosiopolis. Basalt grit cannot be dug silently. It hisses. It betrays. The bishop straightens. He takes the small iron pectoral cross from his neck and lays it on the parapet stone. He turns to the man at his elbow, a deacon from the lower town who once kept the granary accounts and now keeps tally of the dying. "Bring me a barrel of the sour wine," he says, "and a drum filled with dried peas. And the boy with the good ears, quickly." This is the story of how 300 defenders, under a bishop who had never held a sword in his life, held a city against 30,000 Persians for 112 days in the summer and autumn of the year 502. They paid 20 pounds of silver. They did not open the gates. They did it on a question of inches of basalt grit under a tower in the dark. Procopius, writing 50 years later in De Bello Persico, gives the campaign one sentence and an obvious lie. He says that Theodosiopolis was unwalled and surrendered at once. The Syriac chronicler Joshua the Stylite, writing within a decade of the events, names the bishop by name and describes the siege day by day. The two accounts cannot both be right. I read Procopius 3 times before I noticed what he isn't saying. He doesn't say the city fell. He doesn't say it held. He says it was taken. And then he writes the next sentence about a different city entirely. That is not how Procopius writes when the answer is simple. To understand what happened in those 112 days, you have to understand how a city of unmortared basalt blocks ended up defended by an aging notary in a wool cope, a deacon who used to count grain sacks, and 300 old soldiers whose names no Roman scribe ever bothered to record. You have to understand what the new emperor in Constantinople had just done to his eastern frontier. And you have to understand who Kavad, the king of kings of Persia, really was on the day his army camped along the upper Euphrates. But first, the rasp under the south tower. That sound will decide everything. Theodosiopolis sat on the Armenian plateau at 1,900 meters above the sea, near the source of the Euphrates, on the only carriage road that ran east from Roman Armenia into Sasanian territory. The walls were not the polished limestone of Antioch or the brick and mortar of the Hexamilion. They were dark basalt, quarried from the cone of an extinct volcano 3 days' march to the north, cut into rough blocks and stacked without lime. The men who built them, by Procopius's later admission in De Edificiis, had relied on the weight of the stones themselves and the patient hatred of the basalt for water. Rain ran off. Frost did nothing. The walls had stood since the reign of Theodosius I, and they would, if no one helped, stand for another century. In the high summer of the year 502, no one was going to help. The strategos of the city, a man named Constantine, had been withdrawn 6 months earlier by order of the Magister Officiorum in Constantinople. The reason was political and small. There had been a rumor, possibly true, that Constantine had taken communion from a Monophysite priest in the lower town. The Chrysargeron had recently been abolished by the new emperor Anastasius, and the imperial bureaucracy was looking for officers whose loyalty to Chalcedonian orthodoxy was unambiguous. Constantine was loyal. He was also Armenian, and he had a wife from the Mamikonian house, and the wife had cousins in Persian Armenia. Constantinople sent him to Mesopotamia and replaced him with no one. The garrison went with him. 2,000 Limitani, the frontier troops who had drilled in the same square inside the citadel for 30 years, marched south in February. Theodosiopolis kept the watchmen on the gates. Old men, men too crippled for the field army, 300 in all, and the bishop and the merchants, and a population of perhaps 15,000 souls inside the walls, and another 4,000 in the villages that ran along the Euphrates. Then in early August, the dust came up on the eastern horizon. Kavad I, king of kings of Persia, was at that moment 45 years old by the eastern reckoning, possibly 47 by the western. The chronicles do not agree, and the Sasanian court did not date its kings the way the Romans dated their consuls. He had already been deposed once, in the year 496, by his own nobles. He had spent 2 years as a hostage among the Hephthalite Huns. He had returned in 499 at the head of a Hephthalite cavalry force, taken back his throne, and spent the next 3 years rebuilding an army that would teach the new Roman emperor what a Sasanian king of the Iranshar could do when he was not paid the customary subsidy for guarding the Caucasus gates. The subsidy mattered. For 200 years, the Romans had paid a fixed amount of gold every year to whichever Persian king held Iberia, in exchange for the Persians keeping the northern passes closed against the Huns. It was, by Theophanes' count, 12 talents annually. It was, by Joshua the Stylite's count, much less but with grain attached. The exact sum is lost. What matters is that Anastasius, who had taken the purple in April of 491 and whose great reform was the abolition of the chrysargeron tax to relieve the poor, had also decided that he would no longer pay tribute to Persia for work the Persians were going to do anyway. The argument was administrative. The consequence was an army of 30,000 on the upper Euphrates in August of 502. Kavad did not come for Theodosiopolis first. He came for Amida, 4 days' march to the south. But the road to Amida ran through the Armenian plateau, and Theodosiopolis sat on it like a small, dark stone in a man's boot. The king sent envoys ahead. The envoys, by Joshua's account, offered the city the standard terms: open the gates, pay 1 talent of silver, accept a Persian garrison for 6 months, and be permitted to retain your bishop and your civil law. By the count of the merchants, those terms were not bad. The merchants went to Eutychios. Eutychios was, in the summer of his 54th year, a man who had taken orders late. He had spent his 20s and 30s as a notary in the office of the Praetorian prefect at Antioch. He had read law. He had drafted tax assessments. He had argued in writing with finance ministers over the assessment of vineyards in Cilicia and lost twice and won once. When his wife died in the year 491, the same year Anastasius took the purple, he had liquidated the household, given the proceeds to the church of St. Theodore the Recruit, and walked north into Armenia, where the bishop of Theodosiopolis, a kindly old man named Pharasmanes, had needed someone who could write Greek and Syriac both. Eutychios stayed. He took deacon's orders at 41, priests at 46, and when Pharasmanes died of pneumonia in the winter of 499, the synod of the province confirmed Eutychios in his chair almost by default. He was not a holy man in the desert father tradition. He was not a theologian. He was a competent administrator who happened to wear a cope. When the merchants came to him with Kavad's terms, Eutychios listened. He took the small iron pectoral cross from his neck, the one a deacon at Antioch had given him on the day of his ordination, plain, without ornament, a piece of nail iron beaten flat by a smith in the Cilician gates, and he set it on the table between them. "Tell the envoys," he said, "that the city will consult the strategos." "There is no strategos, your grace." "Then tell them the city will consult Constantinople." "Constantinople will not answer for 3 weeks." "Then we have 3 weeks before we open the gates." The merchants stared at him. Joshua the Stylite, in chapter 48 of his chronicle, says that Eutychios at that moment smiled. Not the smile of a holy fool, but the smile of a man who had once won an argument over Cilician vineyards by pointing out very politely that the prefect's clerk had used the wrong unit of measurement. Joshua may be embellishing. Joshua was a sympathetic chronicler writing on the Syriac side. But the smile, if it is real, is the moment the siege began. 3 days later, on the 17th of August, by Joshua's count, Kavad's army arrived. The dust on the eastern horizon resolved into 30,000 men in column. The Hephthalite cavalry, Kavad's own, the men who had put him back on the throne, were on the wings, on the small steppe horses the Greeks called hippoi takistoi. The infantry, mostly conscripted Mesopotamian peasants under Persian officers, marched 4 abreast on the carriage road. The siege train came last. 4 iron-headed rams, 3 timber towers and sections on ox carts, and a quantity of bronze sheathing for the sapper galleries that the chronicle does not bother to count. Eutychios watched them from the south tower. He had moved his bed into the upper guard chamber 2 nights before. The deacon with the granary tally stood beside him. "How many?" the bishop asked. "By Kavad's count, 30,000. By ours, perhaps 26. How long can we feed 300 soldiers and 15,000 civilians? At 2 modi of barley per soldier per week, and 1 modius per civilian, through November, maybe. Cut both rations by half. That will not be enough, your grace. It will have to be. Now, go and find me the man who taught Constantine's sappers to listen for picks in the rock. I want him on the south tower before sunset." The man, when they brought him up the curtain steps an hour later, turned out to be a retired fosser, a military digger, named Iovianus, from Theodosiopolis itself, who had served 26 years in the Limitanii and who walked with a limp from a Lazic war wound in his left calf. He listened to Eutychios's question. "If Kavad's engineers begin a mine under the south tower, on which side will they enter the basalt?" And he scratched his beard and said something that the bishop wrote down on a wax tablet that same night. He said, "The basalt will betray them, your grace. It cannot be dug quietly. If they come, we will hear them. The question is whether we will be ready to dig back." To understand how a notary bishop and a one-legged fossor and 300 old men ended up holding the Armenian plateau against Kavad, the king of kings, you have to understand what the empire in Constantinople had already done to itself, and what Kavad had survived to become the king he was. The walls of Theodosiopolis would hold or fall on a question of inches of basalt grit in the dark. But the reason the walls were unmanned in the first place, the reason Eutychios stood on the south tower in a wool cope instead of a strategos in a lorica, was a decision made 18 months earlier in a council chamber 1,000 miles away by an emperor who had never seen the Euphrates and an accountant who had never heard the bishop's name. The decision had been made in a small triclinium off the consistorium of the great palace in Constantinople in February of the year 501 by 3 men who had never been east of Cappadocia. The Emperor Anastasius was not in the room. The Magister Officiorum was. The Praetorian Prefect of the East was. A finance secretary whose name has not survived was. The question on the table was whether the strategos of Theodosiopolis, Constantine son of John, an Armenian of Mamikonian connection, was reliable on the matter of Chalcedonian orthodoxy. The finance secretary had a letter from a deacon in Theodosiopolis, claiming that Constantine had taken the bread from the hand of a priest who was known to teach Severan doctrine. The Praetorian prefect did not believe the letter. The Magister Officiorum did not disbelieve it. The decision in the end was administrative rather than doctrinal. With the Chrysargeron tax recently abolished, the treasury was short and the limitanii of Theodosiopolis were expensive. Move the strategos. Move the garrison. Let the bishop and the merchants run the city for a season. If Persia stayed quiet, the saving was real. If Persia did not, well, Ariobindus the Magister Militum per Orientum was in Edessa, 4 days' march away, with a field army. 4 days' march. The phrase appears in the minute of the council, preserved secondhand by Joshua the Stylite, who probably had it from a clerk who had seen the document. 4 days, on a good road, in dry weather, with a field army that was not engaged elsewhere. That was the safety margin. By August of 502, Ariobindus would be engaged elsewhere. He would be at Constantia, watching a separate Persian column under a Hephthalite officer named Adar Mahan, and he would not learn that Theodosiopolis was under siege until the 11th day of the investment. By then, 4 days was already a number from a different calendar. Anastasius, when he eventually heard of the council's decision, did not object. The emperor was 68 years old in 501, a former silentiary of the bedchamber who had ridden the curses to the purple through one strategic marriage and the unexpected death of Zeno. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had spent 30 years watching imperial finances bleed, that the empire's enemies were almost always cheaper to bribe than to fight, and that any imperial gold not spent on bribing them was gold available for the wall builders, the granaries, the aqueducts. He had abolished the chrysargeron because the chrysargeron pressed the poor, a humane reform by Theophanes' acid summary that ended up costing the empire 2 field armies before it paid for itself in the loyalty of the urban poor. He had also stopped paying kavad. The chrysargeron had been abolished a few years earlier, by Theophanes' count in the year of the emperor's 7th consulship, around 498. The Persian subsidy was suspended not long after. Kavad, who was 3 years into his second reign and still owed an enormous arrears of pay to the Hephthalite cavalry that had restored him, sent an embassy to Constantinople in January of 501, asking for the customary gold. Anastasius refused. The embassy returned. Kavad sent a second embassy in June. Anastasius refused again, but offered, as a courtesy, a single payment of 300 pounds of silver, perhaps a tenth of the customary subsidy, and an insult by Sasanian protocol. The second embassy went home in August. By September, the Persian court had begun to gather the army that would march in the following summer. Kavad did not march for plunder. The chronicles agree on this, and the reader should believe them. He marched because he could not afford not to. The Hephthalite officers who had put him on his throne in 499 needed to be paid. The Persian nobility, who had deposed him once and could do it again, needed to see results. The eastern frontier had been quiet for nearly 40 years under his father Peroz and his uncle Balash, and a quiet frontier was, to a Sasanian king of kings, a frontier on which his authority slowly evaporated. If Anastasius would not pay, Kavad would take. He did not need very much. He needed enough to pay the Hephtalites through the winter and to be seen, by his own nobles, to have answered the Roman insult. Of his own life, there are details that the chronicles keep. He had been deposed in 496 for, among other reasons, his patronage of the Mazdakite movement, a religious social teaching by a priest named Mazdak that called for the redistribution of property and women, and that Kavad, as a young king, had publicly tolerated. The nobility had hated it. They had imprisoned him in the so-called Castle of Oblivion in Susiana. He had escaped, by one version of the chronicle, disguised as a woman in his wife's clothes, by another, smuggled out in a barrel of dates. He had ridden east to the Hephthalite court and asked for asylum. The Hephthalite Khan had given him cavalry and a daughter, both. With them, Kavad came back. By 502, the Mazdakites were no longer his concern. The Hephtalites and the nobles, and the army, and the question of his own authority, those were his concern. Theodosiopolis was the smallest possible answer to all 4 questions at once. A walled provincial city with no garrison and a bishop in command. Take it in 10 days, move on to Amida, be home by spring with enough silver and enough prestige. This, then, was the world that had assembled itself outside the basalt walls in the high summer of 502. A new emperor in Constantinople who believed in administration over arms. A king of kings in Ctesiphon who needed a small, visible victory. A strategos withdrawn for the wrong reason. A field army 4 days too far. And in the middle of all of it, a 54-year-old former notary in a wool cope who on the 3rd evening of the siege climbed down from the south tower into the lower town and walked, alone, to the house of a woman he had buried 3 weeks before. The woman's name was Maria. She had been a widow of one of the Limitanii withdrawn south with Constantine the previous winter. She had 4 children. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 6, had stopped eating on the 2nd day of the siege and had not eaten since. Eutychios had baptized the boy himself the previous Easter. The mother, on the morning of the 40th day of the siege, had walked to the south gate, carrying the child wrapped in a blanket, and had stood there for some time, looking up at the gate captain. The gate captain had sent word to the bishop. Eutychios came down from the tower and walked to her in the dust of the unpaved street. He did not ask her what she meant to do. He could see what she meant to do. Joshua the Stylite, who recorded this scene at second hand through a priest who had been present, says that the bishop knelt in the dust beside her and put his hand on the child's forehead and said 3 sentences. Joshua gives only the first. If you put him out, they will not feed him. He does not give the second or the third. He says only that the woman sat down in the dust, and the bishop sat down with her, and the gate captain looked away. Eutychios broke that night. Not visibly. He went back up to the south tower and he gave the order to cut the soldiers' barley ration from half a modius to a third. He gave the order to open the church granary, the small one, the bishop's own, the grain set aside for the winter masses, and to distribute 1 cup of grain per household in the lower town. He did not give the order to open the gates, but he understood, on that night, that he might give it. The understanding sat in him like a stone. The deacon who had counted the dying brought him a cup of warm wine, and he drank it, and he said nothing for an hour. And then he said, "How long now, if I open the small granary again?" "Through the end of October," the deacon said. "Maybe." The bishop nodded. He took the small iron pectoral cross from his neck and laid it on the wax tablet on the table. He looked at it for a long time, then he put it back on. Up on the parapet, a watchman was singing under his breath, an old soldier's song from the eastern frontier, slow, about a horse that knew the way home in the snow. The bishop listened to it and counted, in his head, in the half-language of a former clerk. 15,000 civilians, 300 soldiers, 41 days behind, perhaps 70 days ahead. The arithmetic did not work. The arithmetic had not worked for 3 weeks. He had been pretending, in the cold administrative way he had learned in the prefect's office at Antioch, that arithmetic was not the only language available. In Kavad's camp at that hour, half a mile to the east of the South Tower, a different conversation was happening. The King of Kings was sitting in his tent with 2 officers and a man named Adur Gushnasp, who had been quartermaster of the army for 6 years and who knew, in detail, the rate at which 30,000 men consumed barley on the Armenian plateau in the autumn rains. Adur Gushnasp was telling Kavad that the rain had begun 2 days early. The roads back to Nisibis were already deteriorating. If the siege went into November, the supply train would not make it home before the snow closed the bitless passes. The army, he said carefully, could go home empty. Or it could go home with 1 talent of silver and the strategos' standard from a captured city. But it could not go home in February with both an empty supply train and no city taken. The nobility would notice. Kavad listened. He looked at Adur Gushnasp for a long time. He did not raise his voice. By every chronicle's account, Kavad almost never raised his voice. He said, "How long now, until the South Tower mine reaches the Basalt?" 8 days, perhaps 10, the quartermaster said. "The sappers have begun to hit the rough grit. They are slowing. The chief engineer says the Basalt is more difficult than the surveyors estimated." "How long?" the King of Kings asked. "Until the rain breaks the roads behind us." 20 days, 25. "Then we have 15 days, said Kavad, to take this city. After 15 days, we offer them terms, and we go home with whatever they will give us." He looked into the wine cup in his hand. He had been deposed once in his 30s for being too patient with the Mazdakites. He could not afford to be too patient with a basalt wall and a notary bishop. That night, in the 75th hour after Maria had carried her child to the south gate, the rasp under the south tower began. It was, at first, almost inaudible. The watchman who had been singing the horse and snow song heard it as a vibration in the soles of his caligae rather than a sound. He stopped singing. He bent down and put his palm flat against the basalt. He counted to 40, the way Iovianus, the one-legged fosser, had taught him to count. Then he ran down the parapet steps to find the bishop. By the time the watchman reached the upper guard chamber, the rasp had become, very faintly, a hiss. Eutychios was already awake. He had not been sleeping for 3 days. He came up the steps with the deacon and Iovianus behind him, and he laid his ear to the inside of the south curtain wall, in the place his guards have learned not to disturb him, and he listened. The Persian sappers under the south tower were perhaps 5 paces in. He turned to the deacon. He said the line that would, 50 years later, end up in chapter 48 of Joshua the Stylite's Chronicle, the line that Joshua attributed to him, but that Eutychios' own clerk wrote down on a wax tablet that same night and that survives, in copy, in a 10th century manuscript in the Patriarchate of Antioch. "Bring me a barrel of the sour wine and a drum filled with dried peas, and the boy with the good ears, quickly." This was the moment that the siege of Theodosiopolis stopped being a question of food and arithmetic. From here on, it would be a question of basalt grit, of how patiently one man can count to 40, of where exactly in the dark under a tower a countermine should cross a sapper mine to break it without bringing the tower down on the defenders' own heads. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces and the smaller ones that saved cities, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to the South Tower in the dark on the 78th night. The barrel of sour wine came up the curtain steps on the shoulders of two deacons. The drum of dried peas came up behind it on the shoulders of a 14-year-old novice named Gennadius, whom Iovianus, the one-legged fosser, had been training for 2 weeks to do one thing and to do it well. The thing was this. You took the barrel of sour wine. You set it upright in the cellar of the South Tower against the inside face of the basalt wall at the spot where the watchman had heard the hiss. You put the drum of dried peas on top of the barrel. You did not touch either. You sat down on the cellar floor in absolute silence, and you watched the surface of the peas. When the Persian sappers swung a pick against the basalt grit, the floor of the tower would vibrate. The vibration would travel up through the barrel, into the head of the drum, and the dried peas would jump. You could see the jump even if you could not hear the swing. You could count the swings. From the count, you could estimate the depth of the sapper gallery, the number of sappers working, the rhythm of their shifts. Iovianus had learned this trick from an old fosser on the eastern frontier, who had learned it in turn, by his own account, from a footnote in the Mechanica of Heron of Alexandria. The peas jumped. Gennadius counted. He counted 4 swings in a long minute, then 3, then 4 again. He counted again. He looked up at Iovianus, who was crouched against the cellar wall with his bad legs straight out in front of him, and he said, 4 sappers, your grace. 2 shifts. They are about 10 cubits in and about a cubit and a half below us. Eutychios, who had come down the steps behind them and was standing in the cellar in his cope, looked at Iovianus. Iovianus said, a cubit and a half below us is enough room. We can drop a counter gallery on them. We need 8 diggers and a knight. We have 8, said the bishop. We have until dawn. Start. Joshua the Stylite, in chapter 51 of his chronicle, names 6 of the 8 diggers. They were named Sergius, Mar Abba, Theodore, the Armenian Vahan, the Goth Ulfila, a Christianized Goth, one of the Federate veterans who had drifted east into Limitani service in the previous generation, and a man whom Joshua records only as the carpenter from the lower town. The other 2 Joshua does not name. They were, by the deacon's tally, all over 40 and all veterans of the Limitani, withdrawn the previous winter, who had refused, individually and without coordination, to march south with Constantine because they had families in the lower town. Iovianus put a pick in each of their hands. He explained the angle of attack. He explained that they were going to dig down at a 40-degree slope for 6 cubits and then turn left into the soft tuff that lay under the basalt, and that they were going to come out, if the calculation was right, 2 cubits above the roof of the Persian sapper gallery and behind the lead sapper. He explained that on no account were any of them to swing a pick when the peas were not jumping in the drum upstairs. If the peas were still, the sappers were resting, and the sappers would hear a Roman pick the way Iovianus had heard a Persian one. The Persian sappers had a name for the senior man among them, a chief engineer named Mir Narse, named in passing by Procopius and not by Joshua. Mir Narse had brought his crew up from Nisibis on Kavad's orders 6 weeks earlier. He had begun the gallery on the 63rd night of the investment, when it became clear to him that the ram called Iron Mountain, Ku-i-Ahanin, in the Pahlavi of the Chronicles, was not going to crack the south curtain. He had calculated, on the basis of his own surveyor's reports, that the basalt under the tower would be loose for 2 to 3 cubits and then compact for another 4. He was wrong by perhaps a cubit. The basalt grit, the volcanic gravel that the engineers of Constantius had packed between the unmortared blocks, ran a full cubit deeper than his surveyors had estimated. It was costing his sappers 2 extra nights of work. He did not know that on the 78th night, 2 cubits above his lead sapper's head, a counter gallery was being dug down toward him by men who had been listening to the rhythm of his picks since the 2nd hour after sunset. He did not know that Iovianus had, by midnight, mapped the entire length of his gallery from peas jumping in a drum. By the 3rd hour of the morning of the 79th day, perhaps 4 in the morning by a modern reckoning, The hour before any light at all on the Armenian plateau in late October, the Roman counter-gallery broke into the Persian sapper gallery from above and behind. The Goth Ulfila came through first. He was carrying a short sword from his own grandfather's chest, a spatha with a tang loose in the hilt, and a blade that had not seen daylight for 40 years. The first thing he saw was the lead sapper's lamp on a wooden hook. The first thing he did was knock the lamp out. The sappers, in absolute darkness, fought him with their picks. He killed two before the others ran back down the gallery toward the Persian camp. By the time Mir Narsa was awakened in his tent at the 3rd hour and a quarter, the Roman diggers had collapsed the Persian gallery roof at 3 points using prepared timber wedges that Iovianus had taught them to drive in with leather mallets. The south tower did not fall, the Persian mine did. There would not be another mine attempt against Theodosiopolis. The Basalt had betrayed them, as the one-legged Fosser had said it would. Kavad learned of the collapse at dawn. By every chronicle's account, he did not raise his voice. He sent for Adur Gushnasp, his quartermaster, who had been telling him for 10 days that the rain was breaking the roads. He sent for Mir Narsa, who came in a working tunic with mud to his elbows, and reported what had happened in 3 sentences. The King of Kings looked at both men for some time. He said, "How many days now, until the Bitlis passes close?" 12, said Adur Gushnasp. "Perhaps 13. "Then we offer them terms today," said Kavad, "and we go home." The terms came up the carriage road that afternoon under a white pennant escort. They were considerably less than the terms of August. They asked for 100 pounds of silver, the use of the carriage road for the Persian supply train as far as the Euphrates ford, and the surrender of any Persian deserters who had crossed into the city during the siege. They did not ask for the gates. They did not ask for a garrison. They did not ask for the bishop. Eutychios met the envoys in the courtyard of the basilica. He was wearing the same wool cope he had worn for 112 days. He had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in the last 2 weeks. Adur Gushnasp was not in the envoy party. That detail the deacon's tally records. But his second was, a man who knew the quartermaster's hand. The bishop listened to the terms. He said, 100 pounds of silver, the city does not have. The carriage road, the city does not own. The deserters, and here he paused, there is one. We will discuss him. The one deserter was a Persian quartermaster's clerk, a man of about 50 named in Joshua's chronicle only as the clerk from Susiana, who had crossed the wall on the 41st night. He had crossed because his own son, a boy of 15 in Kavad's commissariat, had been beaten to death by a Hephthalite officer for spoiling a sack of barley in transport. The clerk had come over the wall with a list. The list, which Eutychios still had in the drawer of his writing table in the basilica, named 17 places along the Persian supply line where grain was being held in unguarded depots and gave the quantities. The clerk from Susiana had been, since the 41st night, the reason the bishop had known when to cut the soldier's ration and when to open the small granary. He had been the reason that on the night of the 78th day, 300 old soldiers were still standing on the walls. His name, written in his own hand at the top of the list he had brought over the wall, was Adur Gushnasp. Eutychios told the envoys that the deserter had died of fever on the 69th night, and that the city had buried him in the small Armenian cemetery west of the gate. He had the deacon bring a wax tablet with the date of burial, written that morning. The envoys looked at the tablet. They did not ask to see the grave. They went back to Kavad's tent in the cold autumn light. By the next day, the King of Kings had taken 20 pounds of silver and a written guarantee of safe passage along the carriage road, and he had broken camp. The army marched south toward Amida, which Kavad would take on the 94th day of his siege there in January 503, by burying the wall and earthworks 4 stadia long, a different siege with a different garrison, which I will return to another time. The supply train, by Adur Gushnasp's own warning, did not entirely make it home. 2 of the 4 siege towers had to be abandoned on the road below the Bitlis Pass. The Hephthalite cavalry, who had been promised silver, were given a Roman bishop's coin minted 20 years earlier and grumbled. In Theodosiopolis, the gates stayed shut for 3 more days because Eutychios did not believe Kavad until the dust on the eastern horizon had been gone for 72 hours. This is where the chronicles begin to disagree, and where I have to tell you which one I lean toward and why. Procopius, writing 50 years later in Justinian's court in Constantinople, claims that Theodosiopolis was taken by Kavad in the early days of the campaign, looted and abandoned. He gives the line in a single sentence in passing in the early chapters of De Bello Persico. Joshua the Stylite, writing within a decade